Welcome back everyone, be here with a new Unreal tutorial. This time we will continue with the archery minigame from my previous video. In the last video I implemented the bow and the arrow logic. This time we will create a gallery with tags as a target. Okay, let's do this. Let's take a look at the scene. I have here the bow. This is the gallery, which is also a blueprint in charge of it's a game controller to control the score and all the tags that goes along these two splines, this and this. And here is an example of one of the targets, this tag. The target is the element who moves along the spline. Okay, let's open first the blueprint game controller. The game controller for the archery minigame is an actor. It's a C++ class which stands from an actor. We have these components. We have spline 1, which is a spline component. We have the second one. We have this text renderer component, and I added these elements to represent the gallery. This is just static mesh that I added with add component. Okay, let's open the code. So the archery game controller extends from actor. As usual, we have the root, a scene component to keep everything together. We have the first spline, the second spline, and finally the score. And as usual, we just have to create each sub-object. The root, then we have the spline, the second spline, and the score. Everything goes attached to the root. That one, and that one. For each spline, we set an initial duration of 1. For the score, we just have a 0, an initial text. Next thing I have for the game controller is the target that I'm going to spawn, which in this case are the tags. So this is the blueprint that I'm going to keep a reference on the editor. And I have 4 references. I spawn 4 tags, so I have 4 references. I also have these 2 properties, which sets the time of each spline. I have one for the first one and the other one for the second one. And finally, I keep the current score. So we can see in the begin play that I spawn each tag or each target and assign a specific spline. So I do the same for the 4 targets. The first one, which I spawn using that blueprint that I'm gonna set on the editor, and taking as a transform the first spline. I do the same with the second one. So the first and the second goes to the first spline, the one at the bottom, and same for the 2 tags for the top spline. One spline over here and second spline over here. After that, I initialize each target using this method, and I send the spline, which the target is set, and the total time. And this is just when each target is going to start moving. And that's the same for each target. Second target, I start moving this target at 10 seconds. Then I have the next 2 at 8 seconds and 60 seconds. And finally, I set the current score to 0. Finally, I have this method that I'm going to use from the target. And it's just when I hit one of the targets with one of the arrows, I call this method. And this method is very simple. I just set the current score to one more, and I basically update the text. So I get the current score, I convert it to string, and I set the text. And that's it for the Archery game controller. Let's take a look at one of the targets. And it's just an actor class, a simple actor class. And the same, we have a root, we have a static mesh, and I have two box colliders. This one at the top and this one at the bottom. And this is because I don't really have a static mesh to represent the trigger. So a collision. So I basically have two boxes to try to cover the whole thing. But this is not the best way to do it, but for the purpose of this tutorial it's more than enough. So I use these box components as a box collision to detect if an arrow hits the duck. And finally I added these hit particles that I will use in the event graph. Let's go to the code now. Okay, so as usual we have the root, static mesh, and both triggers, both two components. And as I said, it extends from actor. Nothing new over here in the constructor. We just create all the sub objects and attach all of them to the root. So we have the root, then we have its static mesh, the static mesh attached to the root, its trigger attached to the root as well, and that's it. And finally I have two events, the same events for both triggers. I have here the first one, which is begin overlap. I use this begin overlap method to detect if there is any overlap. And I have here the other one, and I use the same method for both hits. And this is basically when an arrow hits any of these triggers, it will use this function. Okay, let's take a look at that function. Okay, I have this boolean just to make sure that I don't collide if I can use the collision or not. Then I detect what type of actor is the one that is colliding, and in this case it will be an arrow. Next thing I do is I attach the arrow to the hit trigger. And nothing new here. I take the base of the arrow. Remember, this is a pickup, and we have a base, a box which is a base. So I take that and attach to the trigger, and I keep the world transform to keep the same location and rotation of the arrow. Then I set to false the collision, so I won't collide anymore. After that, I hide the target, only the mesh. And this is for later. This is to tell the target that stop moving. I set this variable to 0. So I use this variable later for the movement. And then I do some more actions, which is call on target hit on the current game controller, because I keep a reference to the Archery game controller, so I can use this method. And remember, I use this only to set the score, so I will have one more point. I call the blueprint event to show the particles, and finally I call this onHit method on the arrow. And the last thing is just set this to false. Okay, let's take a look at some of these variables that I have set on the target. So this is the blueprint event that I will use when this hit happens on the target, on the event graph. that's just simply a Blueprint implementable event. This means basically that you can use it on Blueprint, but there is no implementation in C++. So next thing, we have this boolean and this one and this one. So these elements are basically to handle the movement of the target and some elements that I will show later on the tick. So I have collision enabled for the collision. I have the B is moving to check if the target is moving or not. I use this for handle any elements on the tick that goes with that. That's the other boolean that I use on the tick for waiting after a hit happens. If you remember, in the Archery game controller, if we go to initialized, I initialized each target with the spline, with the reference to the game controller, the time for the spline, and the initial movement delay. And that is what's happening here. I have here the initialize method with the game controller reference, the spline, and the path time and the start time. And that's what I have here. I keep its reference. Next thing I do on the initialize is set to false the mesh, so it won't show at the beginning. I set like the collision is gonna be false, so nothing is gonna hit as soon as the initialize happens. The duck is not moving. I set this to 0, and the rest of the things I set this to false. This is not gonna wait for end to hit. And this is a boolean that I keep to start moving the target. Okay, the rest of the logic for the target is when the target moves, and that happens on the tick. Okay, so first thing happens on the tick is this. As soon as I initialize the target, I will wait a little bit to start moving. So I have this boolean on the initialize is going to be true. That means we're going to wait to move the target. So I use the current delta time float, and I just wait for that delay to reach that delay. I set that to 0, and I said that I don't want to wait anymore. So this is false. Next thing it happens, I get the start time that this target is going to start to move, and I use the get time seconds, which is the total seconds on the wall. Next thing, I set to true the mesh. I allow the collisions to happen, and I set this element to true, so the target is going to start moving. And obviously I set this to false, so this part over here won't happen. Okay, each target moves along the corresponding spline. So for set the direction of the duck and also the point in the spline, we have two functions. So this is the current spline that this target is on. So we have, for one side, for the position, we have this method, which is get location at distance along its plane. So this will give us a point in the world space. And the same with the rotation, we can get exactly the direction like this. So this is how I calculate this. First, we need the distance, and that's basically the length of the spline plus the current time. The current time is the total time in the wall. That means since you press play minus this start time. And remember that happens on the initialized. After the delay, when it's going to start moving, I set that start time in the same way. And finally, I need to divide that for the total path time, whatever it is. So I set that on the editor as well. So we have the current time and we calculate the distance. We use that on the method and we get the position. And that's what I do. I set the wall location. Next, for the rotation, I use this. Same, I send the distance and I get a vector, which is a vector director. To convert that to a rotator, we can use this handy method, which will make us a rotator from the x-y-axis with a vector. So we only are interested really on the x-axis because we just need to point the target on that axis, not the rest. And we just need to set the wall rotation. I'm using both the location and the rotation in the wall space, not local space. And this part is just to detect if the target has reached the end of the spline. And we can do that with just simply detecting if this is more than 1. So we just need to reset everything to the start. Finally, the last part I'm gonna explain is basically the wait to end hit, which it happens as soon as an arrow hits the duck. And all I'm doing is basically destroy the current arrow and set everything to false. And also set this to true, so this logic will happen again. So if an arrow reaches one of the ducks, it will go back to the beginning. Okay, if we take a look at the blueprint event that I'm calling over here on target hit, I can show you what I'm doing with that. So on the event graph, I have this on target hit event, and I basically perform a place on at location, and I set to true these particles so we can see those feathers, like those particles. Okay, we can test this archery game controller if we simulate. So we will see what's happening. So we have the first tag on the bottom one, another one is there. So we have 4 in total. They reach the endpoint and they go back to the initial point. And if an arrow hits any of these tags, the tag will stop and go back to initial. And that's it. That's everything for this minigame. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and please subscribe and like if you like this video. Bye!